In life, some stories begin with quiet routines, with the simple rhythm of love between a father and his child, and yet in a single instant, everything can change forever. Robert had learned this lesson the hardest way possible years ago, when his beloved wife died giving birth to their daughter Sophia. From that moment on, his world both collapsed and was reborn. For though he lost the woman he loved most, he gained the fragile, beautiful reason to keep living, his little girl. Robert was a single father, carrying on with resilience, raising Sophia with tenderness and sacrifice. Every smile she gave him was proof that the pain he had endured had a purpose. But behind his strong exterior, there lived loneliness, a quiet emptiness he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Every morning began the same way. Robert waking Sophia gently, her soft curls tumbling over her face, her sleepy eyes half closed as she clung to him before school. They had their rituals, her favorite toast with strawberry jam, the little game of pretending the car ride was a magical chariot, and his endless reminders for her to always be kind, always be brave, and always trust her heart. To outsiders, it looked like a picture of resilience, a father doing everything he could for his daughter. But in Robert's heart, there was always the weight of doing it alone. He missed having someone to share the burdens and joys with, though he never once let Sophia feel that gap. On this particular day, the air was crisp, filled with the golden glow of late afternoon, as Robert held Sophia's small hand while they walked back from school. She talked excitedly about the story her teacher read, her little voice painting worlds of princesses and dragons, while Robert listened with patient joy. He found peace in these small moments, the kind that reminded him why every sacrifice was worth it. But then, without warning, the peace shattered. A roar of an engine, the screech of tires, and the blinding panic of a motorcycle losing control. Everything changed in a flash. Robert's first instinct was to pull Sophia close, his body shielding hers, but the impact struck him hard, sending him crashing to the ground. Pain seared through him, but his only thought was Sophia, her cries, her tiny hands clutching his shirt, her desperate pleas for him to open his eyes. Strangers rushed to help, sirens pierced the air, and in what felt like moments and eternities combined, Robert was lifted into an ambulance, his little girl trembling beside him, her face streaked with tears. For the first time in her young life, Sophia was truly terrified of losing the only parent she had ever known. At the hospital, chaos blended with urgency. Nurses and doctors worked quickly, their voices sharp and filled with commands. Sophia sat alone in the waiting area, her small frame dwarfed by the chairs around her, clutching the stuffed bunny she carried everywhere. Her eyes searched desperately for comfort, for something familiar, for someone who would not leave her. That was the moment Helen entered her life. A doctor with kind eyes, steady hands, and a presence that immediately radiated warmth. Helen was assigned to Robert's case, but when she saw Sophia trembling, lost and alone, something inside her shifted. She knelt beside the girl, introduced herself softly, and held out her hand. Sophia hesitated, then slipped her tiny fingers into Helen's, and for the first time since the accident, she stopped crying. While Robert was being treated, Helen stayed with Sophia. She explained gently what was happening, careful not to frighten her further. She got her juice, told her little stories between medical updates, and even managed to coax a smile. Helen had dedicated her life to medicine, but she had no children of her own, and she often wondered if her path had left her missing something deeper. Looking at Sophia that evening, she felt a connection that was both unexpected and profound. Hours passed before Robert stabilized. When Helen entered his room, Robert was awake but weak, pain etched into his face. Yet the first thing he asked about was Sophia. Helen reassured him that his daughter was safe, that she had stayed by her side the entire time. Relief washed over him, but also a strange gratitude he couldn't yet name. Here was this woman, a stranger who had cared for his most precious treasure as if she were her own. Robert was told he would need to stay in the hospital for several days. He tried to protest, worried about who would take care of Sophia, but Helen interrupted softly, almost instinctively. She would look after her. At first, Robert refused, pride and fear battling inside him. But Sophia clung to Helen's hand, her little voice whispering that she didn't want to be alone, and Robert's resistance broke. For the first time in years, he had to entrust someone else with his daughter's care. And somehow, though it was terrifying, it felt right. That night, Sophia stayed with Helen. It was a simple arrangement. Helen had a spare bedroom, toys from her nieces, and a gentle patience that soothed Sophia's fears. The child fell asleep quickly, curled under the covers with her stuffed bunny, while Helen sat quietly by her side, marveling at how natural it felt to care for her. She had always thought of her career as her purpose, but in that moment, she wondered if maybe her life was leading her to something more. Meanwhile, in his hospital bed, Robert lay awake. He thought of the accident, of the fragility of life, and of Sophia's frightened cries. But he also thought of Helen. The calm strength in her voice, the way Sophia had clung to her, the strange comfort he felt knowing his daughter was with her. He didn't know why, but even in the midst of pain and fear, he sensed that meeting Helen was not an accident. Perhaps fate, in its mysterious way, had brought her into their lives at the very moment they needed her most. And so, without realizing it, a new chapter was beginning for all three of them. A chapter born from tragedy, but one that carried the promise of healing, love, and the possibility of something Robert thought he had lost forever: a family. The following days in the hospital tested Robert's patience and strength in ways he hadn't expected. He had always been the one to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, never asking for help, never showing weakness in front of Sophia. But now he was confined to a hospital bed, his body stitched and bandaged, his movements limited, and he felt the unfamiliar sting of helplessness. What kept him going were the visits from Sophia, her laughter echoing through the sterile corridors, and the gentle presence of Helen, who seemed to appear whenever he needed reassurance most. Helen became more than just his doctor. She became the bridge between Robert's worries and Sophia's innocence. Every morning before school, she helped Sophia call her father, letting her cheerful voice remind him that life was still full of hope. In the evenings, after finishing her rounds, she would bring Sophia back to visit. Sometimes she even stayed longer than necessary, sitting by Robert's bedside, talking with him not as a patient, but as a man whose life had been turned upside down. Their conversations were simple at first, about Sophia's love for drawing, about the accident, about how hard it was raising a child alone. But soon they began to drift into deeper waters. Robert found himself telling her things he hadn't shared with anyone. The loneliness he had endured since losing his wife, the fears he carried of not being enough for his daughter, the quiet exhaustion of always being strong. Helen listened, not with pity, but with a quiet understanding that disarmed him. She had lived her own battles, sacrificing relationships and family for her career, convincing herself that saving lives was enough to fill the emptiness. But hearing Robert speak with such raw honesty awakened something inside her, something she thought had been buried long ago. She realized that while she had saved countless patients, she had never truly allowed herself to be saved by love. Sophia, meanwhile, blossomed under Helen's care. At Helen's home, she discovered a new world. A cozy kitchen that smelled of fresh herbs, a small garden filled with flowers she loved to water, shelves of storybooks that Helen read to her at night. For Sophia, who had always known the strength of her father's love, but also the absence of a mother, Helen became a gentle guide, someone who filled the gaps she didn't even know existed. She began to ask Robert if Helen could come to their house someday, or if she could show Helen her drawings. Each time, Robert's heart stirred in ways he didn't fully understand. As Robert's recovery continued, Helen found excuses to spend more time with him. Sometimes she checked on his progress after her shift was over, though she didn't need to. Other times she brought him a book she thought he'd like, or sat with Sophia in his room, letting the three of them laugh together like a small family. And it was in those moments, in the way Sophia's eyes sparkled when Helen was near, that Robert felt the dangerous but undeniable pull of something more. He tried to resist it. He reminded himself that he had been broken before, that letting someone into his heart could risk everything. Not just for him, but for Sophia too. But love has a way of seeping in through the cracks of fear, and Helen's presence was slowly becoming something he couldn't ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the hospital grew quieter, Helen stayed longer than usual. Robert was sitting up, his arm still in a sling, while Sophia drew pictures at the foot of his bed. They spoke about the accident, about how fragile life could be. And then, almost without meaning to, Robert asked Helen why she had chosen to take care of Sophia that night, why she had gone beyond what her duty required. Helen paused, her eyes meeting his, and after a silence that seemed to stretch forever, she admitted softly, "Because I couldn't bear to see her alone. And because when I saw her, I realized how much love still matters in this world, how much it mattered to me." The honesty of her words struck him like a tide he couldn't push back. For the first time in years, Robert felt the walls around his heart begin to crumble. Sophia, blissfully unaware of the deeper currents between them, held up her drawing. A picture of 3 figures holding hands. A tall man, a little girl, and a woman with flowing hair. She smiled proudly and said, "This is us." Robert's breath caught, and Helen's eyes shimmered with emotion. It was innocent, it was pure, but it was also a vision of something both terrifying and beautiful. The possibility of a family reborn. From that night onward, things began to change subtly. Helen wasn't just a doctor anymore. She was becoming part of their story. She picked Sophia up from school. She helped with homework. And she shared dinners that turned into laughter-filled evenings. And though Robert told himself to be cautious, he couldn't deny the comfort of knowing he no longer had to face the world entirely alone. For the first time since his wife's death, he dared to imagine a future where love was not a memory, but a new beginning. Yet, with hope came fear. Robert still battled with guilt. The guilt of moving on, the guilt of allowing another woman into Sophia's life. He lay awake at night wondering if it was fair to Helen, if it was fair to his daughter, or if he was simply fooling himself into believing he could have happiness again. But then he would see Sophia's joy when Helen was around, and he would feel the quiet steadiness of Helen's presence, and he realized that maybe love was not about replacing the past. It was about building something new. By the time Robert was discharged from the hospital, his bond with Helen had already deepened beyond anything he expected. Walking out of those hospital doors, leaning on his crutch, with Sophia on one side and Helen on the other, he felt a surge of gratitude. Life had knocked him down in the most brutal ways, but it had also led him to this moment, to this unexpected connection that promised healing. And though he didn't know where their story would go, he knew one thing for certain. Fate had brought Helen into their lives for a reason, and he was no longer afraid to find out why. Returning home was both a relief and a challenge for Robert. His apartment, though familiar, suddenly felt overwhelming with its silence and the weight of responsibilities waiting for him. The groceries had spoiled during his hospital stay, the laundry piled high, and the small details of daily life that he usually handled with ease now seemed like mountains. But Sophia's excitement at having her father back gave him strength. She clung to his hand as though she feared he might slip away again, her little voice reminding him of everything that truly mattered. Helen didn't vanish after Robert left the hospital. If anything, her presence deepened in ways Robert hadn't anticipated. She insisted on visiting, first under the excuse of checking his recovery, but soon it became clear her reasons were far more personal. She brought homemade soup, helped Sophia with her school projects, and even watered the small potted plant on their kitchen windowsill, laughing softly as if it were a ritual of her own. For Robert, it was strange at first, having another adult in their space, but soon the warmth she carried became impossible to ignore. Sophia thrived with Helen around. Her drawings multiplied, each page filled with images of 3 figures: a father, a daughter, and a woman with kind eyes. She began to talk about Helen as if she had always been part of their lives, asking if she could invite her to school events, or if they could all go to the park together. Robert tried to temper his daughter's excitement, worried about rushing into something he couldn't fully control. But every time he saw Helen's patience with Sophia, the way she listened to her stories and celebrated her smallest victories, his heart pulled him closer to believing. One Saturday afternoon, Helen invited them both to her flower shop. It was a modest place, filled with the fragrance of roses, lilies, and daisies, with sunlight streaming through the windows. Sophia ran between the rows of flowers, her laughter bouncing off the walls, while Robert stood quietly, watching Helen arrange a bouquet with practiced grace. There was something grounding about her, something steady and unpretentious. He realized that despite her busy life, she had made space for him and his daughter in a way that felt natural, as though they had been waiting for each other. As weeks passed, Robert's admiration for Helen grew into something undeniable. He saw her not just as the doctor who had saved him, but as a woman with a life of her own, filled with sacrifices and quiet strength. She shared stories of her long nights at the hospital, of how she often came home to silence and wondered if she had chosen the wrong path. He shared his memories of Sophia's first steps, the lonely nights when grief weighed heavy, and the fears that sometimes kept him awake. Slowly, without either of them realizing it, their vulnerabilities became the bridge that connected them. But Robert's fears never fully vanished. Late at night, after putting Sophia to bed, he often stared at the photograph of his late wife that still hung on the wall. He wondered if he was betraying her memory by letting Helen into his heart. He worried about what would happen if it didn't work, if Sophia grew attached only to be hurt again. Helen, too, carried doubts. She questioned whether she was strong enough to step into the role fate seemed to be handing her, whether she could love not only Robert but also Sophia in the way they both deserved. The turning point came one rainy evening. Sophia had caught a mild fever, nothing serious, but enough to worry Robert. His movements were still limited, and he struggled to care for her alone. Without hesitation, Helen came over, bringing medicine, soup, and a calm presence that soothed them both. She stayed by Sophia's bedside, reading her stories until the little girl drifted off to sleep. When Robert thanked her, his voice heavy with sincerity, Helen only smiled and said, "You don't have to thank me. I want to be here." In that moment, Robert's resolve crumbled. He realized that Helen wasn't here out of obligation. She was here because she cared, deeply and genuinely. For the first time in years, Robert allowed himself to imagine a future not defined by loneliness or fear, but by love that was patient, steady, and real. Still, neither of them confessed what they felt. Their bond deepened in gestures rather than words. In the way Helen brushed Sophia's hair back from her forehead, in the way Robert's eyes lingered on Helen when she laughed, in the way Sophia instinctively reached for both their hands when they walked together. It was unspoken, delicate, but powerful. And so, life began to shift quietly. Robert healed more with each passing day. Sophia grew brighter with Helen's influence, and Helen herself discovered a joy she hadn't known she was missing. They were not yet a family, not officially, not out loud. But in the small, sacred details of their lives, something new was being written. A story of second chances, of hearts learning to trust again, of love quietly blooming in the most unexpected place. What none of them knew was that the biggest test of their newfound connection was still ahead. A test that would either solidify the bond they were building or shatter it before it fully blossomed. But for now, in the soft glow of everyday moments, Robert, Sophia, and Helen walked together into something that felt like hope. The weeks rolled into months, and the rhythm of their lives intertwined more deeply than Robert or Helen could have imagined. Sophia began to expect Helen's presence at dinner, her seat at the table slowly becoming permanent. For Robert, each evening where Helen's laughter filled his modest apartment felt like a dream he was afraid to wake from. And yet, beneath the surface of this blossoming bond, an unspoken tension grew. Love was stirring, but fear still held their voices captive. One evening, Robert decided to take Sophia and Helen to the park. The sun had just dipped behind the horizon, leaving streaks of pink and orange across the sky. Children's laughter echoed from the swings, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh grass. Sophia darted ahead, her small figure chasing after bubbles blown by another child. Robert watched her with a smile, but his attention soon turned to Helen sitting beside him on the bench. She looked radiant in the fading light, her eyes soft as they followed Sophia. For a moment, he almost confessed everything: his admiration, his gratitude, and the growing love that had taken root in his heart. But the words caught in his throat. Helen, on the other hand, was silently battling her own emotions. Every time Robert's gaze lingered on her, every time Sophia reached for her hand, she felt a surge of belonging she hadn't known she was missing. But her career, her demanding schedule, and the fear of stepping into such a delicate role kept her guarded. She worried about making promises she might not be able to keep, about failing a little girl who already looked at her like family. The fragile peace of their unspoken bond was disrupted when Robert's bank called him back to work. His recovery was nearly complete, and though he had been grateful for the time at home, the thought of returning filled him with both relief and dread. He needed the income, but the stress of his job and the long hours had always taken a toll. Helen noticed his unease, and though she encouraged him, she could see how it wore on him. One night, after putting Sophia to bed, Robert and Helen sat in the quiet living room, sipping tea. The air was heavy with things unsaid. Robert finally broke the silence. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Not of the work, but of losing what we have right now. Sophia is happy. I'm happier than I've been in years, and I'm afraid it'll all slip away." Helen set her cup down gently, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, Robert thought she might finally tell him she felt the same way. Instead, she said softly, "Happiness isn't fragile when it's real, Robert. It adapts. It grows. If it's meant to last, it will." The words gave him comfort, but also left him longing for more. He wanted to hear that she felt what he felt, that she was ready to step into the life they were building together. But Helen wasn't ready, not yet. Their quiet, delicate balance was shaken further by an unexpected twist. Sophia's school held a special event, Family Day. Children were encouraged to bring their parents, to celebrate with games and activities. Sophia, brimming with excitement, looked at Robert and said, "Daddy, can Helen come too? She's family, isn't she?" The question struck Robert's heart like a bell. He smiled gently, hiding the storm of emotions inside, and said, "If she wants to, sweetheart." Helen, standing nearby, felt her chest tighten. The innocence in Sophia's words pierced through all her doubts. She realized she was already part of their lives in ways she hadn't fully acknowledged. On Family Day, the three of them walked into the school together, hand in hand. Parents and teachers noticed, some with warm smiles, others with curious glances. But Robert didn't care. Neither did Sophia, and, for once, neither did Helen. She played games with Sophia, laughed alongside Robert, and when the day ended, she realized it was one of the happiest she had ever known. That evening, after Sophia had fallen asleep, Robert and Helen sat together once more, the silence now thick with something undeniable. This time, Robert didn't hold back. His voice was steady, vulnerable. "Helen, I can't keep pretending. You're more than a friend. You're more than just the doctor who helped me. You've become part of my life, part of Sophia's life, and he paused, his eyes glistening. "I love you." Helen's breath caught, her heart pounding. For so long, she had kept her feelings buried under layers of caution, but hearing the words spoken aloud shattered her defenses. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Robert, I've tried to fight this, to tell myself it was too soon, too complicated. But the truth is, I love you too." The confession hung in the air like a fragile flame, beautiful and bright. Yet even as they embraced, both knew that love was only the beginning. Life had a way of testing hearts, and the path ahead would not be without obstacles. But for the first time, neither of them was afraid of the future. What they didn't know was that the next challenge would arrive sooner than they expected, a challenge that would force them to decide just how strong their bond truly was. Just when Robert and Helen thought they had found their rhythm, life threw them a test neither expected. It began with a phone call late one evening. Robert was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when his phone buzzed. He answered casually, but within seconds his face turned pale. The bank had informed him of a sudden restructuring, and his position, the one he had given years of his life to, was being cut. Panic rippled through him. He had savings, but not enough to sustain long without work, especially with Sophia's needs. His first thought was her, then Helen. What would she think of him now? Would she see him as weak, as unstable? His pride ached as much as his heart. Helen noticed his silence, the way his hands trembled as he put the phone down. "Robert, what happened?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then told her the truth. For a moment, she just looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, without hesitation, she stepped closer and took his hands in hers. "We'll figure this out together. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Her words struck deep. For years, Robert had faced every hardship alone, his entire life revolving around protecting Sophia. To hear someone say, "we instead of you," was enough to bring tears to his eyes. But the following days tested his resolve. He spent hours applying for jobs, attending interviews, and coming home exhausted. Despite his efforts, the rejections piled up. At night, when Sophia was asleep, he would sit in the dim light of the living room, his head in his hands, fighting the fear that he was failing not just as a father, but as a man worthy of Helen's love. Helen, meanwhile, balanced her demanding work at the hospital with being there for both Robert and Sophia. She cooked when Robert was too tired, helped Sophia with homework, and reminded Robert to rest. Slowly, the walls he had built around his heart began to crumble completely. Yet in the back of his mind, doubt lingered. What if Helen grew tired of this struggle? What if she realized she deserved someone with more to give? One evening, as rain tapped against the windows, Helen found Robert staring out into the night, his expression heavy with worry. She approached quietly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Robert," she whispered, "do you know why I'm here?" He turned to her, uncertainty in his eyes. She smiled faintly. "Because I believe in you. Not in your job, not in what you can provide, but in you. The man who loves his daughter more than anything. The man who has shown me what real strength looks like." Her words broke through his fear like sunlight piercing clouds. He drew her into his arms, holding her as if he never wanted to let go. For the first time since losing his job, he allowed himself to believe that this setback was not the end, but the beginning of something new. Days later, hope came in an unexpected form. Helen had mentioned Robert's situation to one of her patients, an older businessman who had once been a loyal client of the bank. Impressed by the way Helen spoke of Robert, the man arranged to meet him. That meeting turned into an opportunity, a position at a smaller but thriving investment firm. The salary was steady, but more importantly, the hours were humane. Robert would have more time for Sophia and for Helen. When he came home with the news, Sophia squealed with joy, hugging him tightly. Helen's eyes glistened with pride. "I told you," she said with a smile. "This is only the beginning." That night, as Robert tucked Sophia into bed, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes and asked, "Daddy, is Helen going to stay with us forever?" The question caught him off guard, but he kissed her forehead and whispered, "I hope so, sweetheart." Later, in the quiet of the living room, Robert sat with Helen by his side. He held her hand, gratitude shining in his eyes. "I don't know what the future holds," he admitted, "but I know one thing. I don't want to face it without you." Helen leaned into him, her voice steady, full of emotion. "Then don't. I'm not going anywhere, Robert." Their love, once fragile and unspoken, now stood firm, tested by hardship and strengthened by trust. The road ahead was still unknown, but they were no longer walking it alone. And in that moment, both of them knew. The future they had once feared was becoming the future they had always longed for. Yet, deep within Robert's heart, he sensed there was still one more step to take. One final act that would seal this bond not just between him and Helen, but between Helen and Sophia. That step would change their lives forever. The following weeks tested the fragile new bond between Robert and Helen in ways neither of them had foreseen. Their confession of love had opened a door, but with it came the weight of reality pressing in on every side. Robert's return to full-time work left him exhausted, and though he tried to keep evenings sacred for Sophia and Helen, the demands of his job often pulled him away. Helen, too, found herself juggling her hospital shifts with the growing desire to spend more time with them, a tug-of-war between her calling as a doctor and her heart's newfound yearning. Sophia, however, seemed blissfully unaware of these struggles. To her, the world had never been brighter. She delighted in their dinners together, the stories Helen told her before bed, and the warmth of a home filled with laughter instead of silence. She began drawing pictures at school of 3 figures holding hands: a man, a woman, and a little girl. When Robert saw them taped proudly to the refrigerator, his heart ached with both joy and fear. Joy that Sophia felt so secure, fear that one wrong step could shatter it all. One Friday evening, the tension surfaced in a small but telling way. Robert had promised Sophia he would be home in time for her school play, a role she had rehearsed for weeks. But a crisis at the bank kept him late, and by the time he arrived, breathless and apologetic, the play was already over. Sophia was in Helen's arms, her face streaked with tears. She looked up at Robert with a fragile smile, but her disappointment was unmistakable. Later that night, after Sophia had gone to bed, Robert sat on the couch with his head in his hands. Helen sat beside him, her voice steady but gentle. "You're trying to carry everything on your own, Robert. Your job, your grief, Sophia, even me. But you can't do it all. You don't have to." His eyes met hers, weary and vulnerable. "I don't want to fail her, Helen. She's already lost so much. I don't want her to feel like she's second place in my life." Helen reached out, taking his hand. "You're not failing her. She knows she's loved. What she needs most isn't perfection. It's presence. And sometimes, Robert, presence means letting others step in too." Her words sank deep, challenging him in ways he hadn't expected. For so long, he had built walls of responsibility around himself, convinced it was the only way to protect Sophia. But maybe, just maybe, sharing that burden was part of building the family they all longed for. Their bond deepened after that night, but the true test came in the form of Helen's career. A prestigious hospital in another city offered her a leadership position, one she had dreamed of for years. When she told Robert, he tried to smile, to be supportive, but his chest felt like it was splitting apart. Sophia, too, overheard, and her little voice trembled as she asked, "But you won't leave us, right?" Helen's heart broke. She hadn't realized until that moment just how entangled her soul had become with theirs. She spent sleepless nights weighing the choice: ambition or love, career or family. Both paths held meaning, but only one made her heart feel whole. On the day of her decision, Helen invited Robert and Sophia to the park where their story had begun to truly shift. The late afternoon sun bathed the playground in golden light, and Sophia ran ahead to the swings, her laughter carrying on the breeze. Helen turned to Robert, her hands trembling slightly. "I thought this offer was everything I wanted," she admitted. "But then I realized something. Dreams change, and mine isn't about titles or hospitals anymore. It's about this, about you, about Sophia, about us." Tears welled in Robert's eyes as relief and gratitude crashed over him. "Helen, are you sure? This is your career, your future." She cut him off with a smile that was both tender and fierce. "My future is standing right in front of me, and I don't want to spend another day pretending I don't already know where I belong." Robert's heart swelled, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of the loneliness he had carried for years lift from his shoulders. They embraced, the setting sun casting a glow around them like a blessing. From a distance, Sophia watched them with wide, knowing eyes. She ran toward them, her small arms wrapping around both their legs as she declared, "Now we're a real family." The 3 of them stood there, bound not by circumstance but by choice, by love, by the courage to believe that even after loss and heartbreak, new beginnings were possible. Yet even in that moment of joy, Robert and Helen both knew the world would continue to test them. Love did not erase struggle, but it gave them the strength to face it together. And for the first time in a very long time, Robert felt not just hope, but certainty. He and Sophia would never walk alone again.